Welcome to part 8, the second to last part in my series of refutations of arguments against using the tropical zodiac in Vedic astrology, especially with sidereal nakshatras. In part 1, I explained that the appeal to tradition is not a logical argument, but is a super good way of making people hate someone. You can very easily demonize your opponent and stir up emotions against him, and emotions are really great for casting a fog over logic. In part 2, I explained that the cultural instability of astrology in the West is not a result of its inferiority, but is a result of the social and religious instability in the West caused by radically new religious movement, Christianity and Islam in the 5th through 8th centuries of the Common Era. In part 3, I demonstrated that the sidereal zodiac is not the observable stars. The constellations are different from the sidereal zodiac. In part 4, I addressed the reluctance that people have to conceive of the nakshatras in a way which is independent from their Rashi. And my point was simply that you feel that way because that's the way you were taught about nakshatras. You were taught that they're constructed by, composed of, the combination of their Rashi, Vimshotri Dasha Lord, and Navamsha. But if you were taught about the nakshatra the way the Vedas teach about them, that they're the abodes of specific gods, then you would see no reason that they couldn't be liberated from their Rashi. An interesting fact is, if the concept that nakshatra are inherently bound to Rashi is true, then how can it be that in the early Vedic astrology, there was no use of Rashis? The nakshatras were conceived in the Rig Veda before there's any mention of Aries, Taurus, etc. In part 5, I corrected the misinformation that the tropical zodiac is more earthly than the sidereal, and also the corresponding misinformation that karma is not earthly. In part 6, I demonstrated or explained how all the symbolism of each sign derives from its ruler, element, and mode, and that these three factors are entirely derived from the sign's relationship to the 4 cardinal tropical points. In part 7, the previous part, I refuted the historical argument which claims that the zodiac was originally sidereal and later got changed to tropical by the Greeks. What I showed there is that the seed form of both the sidereal and tropical paradigms have always coexisted in all astrological culture. Now, here in part 8, I'm going to examine the Indian source texts on astrological calculations to demonstrate that they unanimously describe the zodiac as tropical. The Vedanga Jyotisha is the oldest extant text on astronomy in India, so we should start here. In the Vedanga Jyotisha, there is actually no explicit mention of zodiac signs at all. You'll never hear Aries, Taurus, etc. There's one verse in there which is such a blatant interpolation that every single scholar and commentator on the Vedanga Jyotisha directly says this verse is a later insertion. Really, the Vedanga Jyotisha has nothing to do with Rashis, because Vedic astrology began without having much to do with Rashis at all. What we do have in Vedanga Jyotisha is a reference to the sun's orbit divided into 12 equal divisions and organized around the seasons. And we can see this more clearly in other Vedic literatures, other parts of Yajurveda, such as the Taittiriya Samhita. The Vedanga Jyotisha, in its 5th and 6th texts, anchors those 12 divisions to the southern solstice. And this clearly shows the ancient seed of the tropical paradigm in the Vedanga Jyotisha. The tropical paradigm is that the 12 divisions of the sun's orbit are anchored to the solstices and equinoxes, and that's exactly what the Vedanga Jyotisha is saying in its 5th and 6th texts. First of all, let's start by showing you the solstices and equinoxes. These are the 4 cardinal points. Now this graphic shows that the year, anchored to these 4 points, has 2 halves, a Dakshinayana half and an Uttarayana half. The Uttarayana half is after the sun hits the southern solstice, it begins to move north until it reaches the northern solstice, and then it begins its Dakshinayana, where it begins to move south. So the year has 2 halves. These halves are divided into 3 parts. Each half is divided into 3 parts, and these give you the 6 seasons. The relationship of the equinoxes to the seasons should be clear from this graphic. The equinoxes fall exactly in the middle of the fall and the spring, and the solstices fall exactly in the middle of the 2 hot seasons and the 2 cold seasons. Finally, we put in the months as given in the Taittiriya Samhita. So you can see that each season has 2 months. And so the ascending equinox, the northerly equinox, happens right on the border between the end of Madhu and the beginning of Madhava. And I've given you the rough correlation to the modern calendar months, although our modern calendar has been messed up by the Christians making room for Easter. So they added 9 days. They moved everything over 9 days. But if you erase that 9-day skew, Tapa will be the same as January, Tapasya the same as February, Madhu the same as March, and also Capricorn will be the same as January, Aquarius will be the same as February or Tapasya, Pisces will be the same as March or Madhu. So as you can see, these are the relationships of the seasons to the months and the months to the solstices. And this is the very seed of the tropical zodiac, even though it's not fully developed into the tropical zodiac with the symbolic content of each month being defined. Now these solstices have some relationship to the stars, but they drift. So in the days of the Vedanga Jyotisha, which was a very long time ago, we can say about 3,000 years or more, in those days the solstices looked something like this. In fact, this is a little bit earlier than the Vedanga Jyotisha. This is the Rig Vedic solstices. At the beginning of the Common Era, which is when natal horoscopic astrology began to flourish, we had the solstices in this position, which is very famous and well known to anyone who does Indian astrology, where the ascending equinox is at the beginning of Aśvinī. Here's where the equinoxes are today. Now the ascending equinox is towards the beginning of Uttara Bhadrapada. So the seasons and the 12 divisions of the year are anchored to the solstices, but the solstices move in relation to the nakshatras. So therefore, those 12 divisions move in relation to the nakshatras. Sam Jeppy seems to want to use the Vedanga Jyotisha to establish that the Indian conception of the zodiac was sidereal, which is very difficult to do because, first of all, the Vedanga Jyotisha doesn't directly even mention a zodiac. It only mentions the seed of a zodiac. And second of all, it says that the seed of the zodiac is anchored to the solstices and equinoxes. But his argument seems to rest on the Vedanga Jyotisha's statement in its 8th text that 4.5 nakshatras is equivalent to the length of a season. So his logic seems to be, so the seasons are measured by the nakshatra, so the months must also be measured by the nakshatra, and therefore since the months are the basis for the Rashi, then therefore the Rashi must also be measured by the nakshatra, and since nakshatra is sidereal, that means the Rashi is sidereal. So that seems to be his logic. But unfortunately, this directly contradicts the Vedanga Jyotisha itself. So let's go through these key texts. So let's start with the 5th text. The 5th text makes the point that the year starts at the southern solstice. It says to start the year at the new moon when the sun reaches the southern solstice and begins moving north. Then the next text, the 6th one, it says that the southern solstice occurs at the beginning of Shravishta, and the northern solstice occurs, of course, right opposite of that in the middle of Ashlesha. And then it says very, very importantly that the months of Magha, which is January, and Shravana, which is July, must always begin with these solstices. Now, the naming system of the months is different in the Taittiriya Samhita as it is here, because in the Vedanga Jyotisha, everything is entirely nakshatra-based. So they'll name their months based on where the full moon occurs during that month. Magh becomes the name of the month in which the full moon is in Magha. But they're the same months, they just have different names. So now the next text, the seventh text, talks about how you can measure the solstices and equinoxes to know what month it is. It says that when the sun is moving from the southern solstice to the northern solstice, daylight will increase. And when the sun moves from the northern solstice to the southern solstice, daylight will decrease, night will increase. So this is also fantastically tropical. The tropical zodiac is measured by the ebb and flow of light because it's based on Rash. That's why they're called Rashis, because Rash means sunlight. Then the eighth text tells you the Tithi and Nakshatra for each of the waypoints in between the two ayanas. Then the ninth text is the one that Sam picks up on. It says that seasons also divide the course between this one solstice and the next, and that they last for 4.5 nakshatra. But if we say that the seasons are anchored to nakshatra, then we contradict text 5, 6, and 7, which says they're anchored to solstices. So that argument would be unacceptable. You can't accept an interpretation of text 9, which invalidates text 5, 6, and 7. So Dr. K.V. Sharma, who is the co-author and editor of the English translation of the Vedanga Jyotish, he groups this text, the one that Sam's referring to, the ninth text about the 4.5 nakshatra. He groups it with other texts that describe units of time, from seconds to minutes to hours to years to the yuga, to the 5-year yuga. And he comments that this text is not defining specific seasons, but it's defining an amount of time, which can even be scoped to the moon. The moon can also be given a ritu, or a season, and how long it takes to pass through 4.5 nakshatra. So it's not about the seasons themselves, but about a span of time. And Dr. K.V. Sharma explicitly here cites the Taittiriya Samhita 4.4.11.1, which gives the actual seasons of the year, not just season as a span of time. So the fact that the length of a season is equal to the amount of time it takes the sun to traverse the equivalent of 4.5 nakshatras doesn't mean that the seasons are anchored to the nakshatras, because that would contradict text 5, 6, and 7. So our analysis of Vedanga Jyotish shows that far from defining a sidereal zodiac, it actually doesn't define any zodiac at all in terms of Aries, etc. But it does clearly give the seed form of a tropical zodiac by referring to 12 equal divisions of the sun's orbit that are anchored to the solstices and equinoxes. Now, after examining Vedanga Jyotish, the next text on our list would be Surya Siddhanta, because that's the next oldest text on the subject of Indian astronomy. The Surya Siddhanta is the first text to specifically give the calculations required for horoscopic astrology, the kind of astrology that you and I are familiar with. And the Surya Siddhanta is the first Indian astronomy text to explicitly define the Aries, Taurus, Gemini zodiac that you and I are familiar with. So this definition of the zodiac begins in chapter 14, text 7. Bhachakra nabhav vishuvat dvitiyam samasutragam ayana dvitiyan chanye chatasra pratitastita. The core of the celestial wheel is the line extending from one equinox to the other, and also from one solstice to the other. These 4 points are of utmost importance. Then it says, Tad atareshu sankranti dvitayam punaha. There are 2 borders in between each of those 4 points. In text 9, it says, Bhanur makara sankrante sanmasa uttarayanam karkadeshtu tatavasyat sanmasha dakshinayanam. It takes the sun 6 months to reach the northern solstice after entering Capricorn, and 6 months to reach the southern solstice after entering Cancer. It's anchoring the beginning of Cancer to the northern solstice, and the beginning of Capricorn to the southern solstice. And finally, in the text 10, it says, Meshadyo dvadasaite masastayar eva vatsara. The 12 divisions, Aries and so on, are identical to the months which constitute a year. So this totally refutes Sam Jeppy's claim that a calendar is not a zodiac, because it says directly that Mesh, etc., Aries, etc., those 12 divisions are identical to the months of the year. What Surya Siddhanta is saying here is the same thing that the Vedanga Jyotisha said, when the Vedanga Jyotisha said in text 5 and 6 that the months must always begin with the solstices. Now, after examining the Surya Siddhanta, let us examine the Puranas. Vyasadeva assembled the core of the Puranas from the original Yajurveda of Brahma, but the Puranas were designed in such a way to be narrated again and again. And so they grow until they achieve like an ideal narration. And then that narration is kept as the ideal form of that Purana. The versions of the Puranas which we have today have their last updates around the same time that the Surya Siddhanta was composed. It is a huge mistake to consider the Purana to be religious books and that only religious people believe in these things. The Purana give the complete understanding of the Veda. That's why they're called Purana, Purnam. Now there are 18 main Puranas, and each one of them is considered a main Purana because it should cover 10 subjects. And one of those subjects is called Sthiti, which has a lot to do with astronomy. So we find that most of the 18 Puranas have elaborate sections on astronomy. So they're very valuable for understanding Indian astronomy. Many of them, in fact, explicitly define the zodiac. Bhagavat Purana, Vishnu Purana, Vamana Purana, Shiva Purana, Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, and others give explicit definitions of the zodiac. It would be foolish to discount this source of information about the original Indian conception of the zodiac. All of these Puranas give almost the same definition verbatim. And that definition that they give is almost exactly the same as the definition given in Surya Siddhanta, which itself was in complete harmony with the seed definition of the seed of the zodiac given in Vedanga Jyotisha. So let's look at Srimad Bhagavatam's definition of the zodiac, which we'll find in the 5th division, 21st chapter, starting at the 3rd text. It says, Saesha Udgayana Dakshinayana Vaishuvata Sangyabhir Manja Shaigra Samanadbhir Gatibhir. The sun moves at varying speeds through the equinoxes to the northern and southern solstices. Aha, here we are again with the equinoxes and solstices. Arohanavarohana samana sthaneshu yatha savanam abhipadyamano. We measure this orbit of the sun by observing its rise, fall, and midpoints. So we observe how it rises to the northern solstice, falls to the southern solstice, and crosses the midpoints of the equinoxes. Makaradishu rashishu aho ratrani dirga rasva samani vidatte. When it moves through the signs of Capricorn and so on, the days and nights grow longer and shorter or attain equilibrium. Bam, again, it's completely tropical. Everything about this is tropical. We're talking about solstices, equinoxes, and the ebb and flow of sunlight. That's all in the 3rd text. In the 4th text, the Bhagavatam says, Yada mesh tulayor vartate tadaho ratrani samanani bhavanti. When the sun is in Aries and Libra, the days and nights are equal. That means that the equinoxes are positioned in reference to Aries and Libra. Yada vrishabhadishu panchasucha rashishu charati tadahanyeva vardhante rasati cha masi masyekaika Ghartika Ratrishu. When the sun is in the 5 signs starting from Taurus, the days grow longer month by month, and then the nights do the same. And finally, in the 5th text, Yada Vrishchikadishu Panchashu Vartate Tadaho Ratrani Viparyani Bhavanti. When the sun is in the 5 signs starting from Scorpio, the days and nights change in the opposite way. So you could not possibly have a more unequivocally tropical definition of what the zodiac signs are. Now, some people will complain that this is not astrology. You're not talking about astrology books, you're talking about astronomy books, but we're not doing astronomy, we're doing astrology. So maybe the astronomical zodiac should be tropical, but not the astrological one. So let's look at what the 3 divisions of astrology, Indian astrology, are. Jyotisha has 3 divisions. The oldest division is Nimitta. Nimitta is the interpretation of celestial or earthly omens. The second division is Hora. Hora is horoscopic astrology, meaning the interpretation of planets in signs, constellations, and houses. Then finally, the third division of Jyotisha is Jnanika. Vedanga Jyotisha is astronomy. Astronomy provides the calculations of where the planets are amidst the signs, constellations, and houses. You cannot interpret where the planets are in the signs, houses, and constellations if you don't know where they are. Saying that astronomy is not integral to astrology or irrelevant to astrology, or that the zodiac could be one thing in astronomy but different in astrology, is like saying that playing cards are irrelevant to poker. You don't need playing cards to play poker. So there's no meaning to saying that. Astronomy is the foundation upon which astrology is based. So the calculation of the zodiac is an astronomical thing. The interpretation of it is astrological. So you cannot say, well, this is just astronomy. Some people bring up the Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra into this argument. Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, first of all, is a Hora Shastra. It's a text dedicated to the interpretation of the positions of planets in signs, constellations, and houses, not the calculation of it. Now, let's consider it anyway. The Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra is estimated to be composed in the 7th or 8th century. But then it was lost for many centuries, until in the 19th century, somebody recompiled it from fragments that he assumed for some reason that they belonged somehow to the original. So what you have in your hands as Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, if you buy it now and read it, is not a 7th century book, but a 19th century reenactment of that book. Definitely this book contains extremely valuable information and techniques, but it cannot be critically accepted as a classical text. We have to accept that the content of this book is to be dated anywhere between the 7th century and the 19th century. In the version that we have today, the Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra definitely does utilize sidereal coordinates for planets. But this is to be expected because look at the date in which it's compiled. As I explained in part 6, when I analyzed the history of things, India had already by this time fully adopted the sidereal zodiac. Whatever argument you make based on the Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra is only a testament to the fact that Indians have been primarily using the sidereal zodiac since about the 7th century at least, which nobody's debating. Now, the best way to defend the Indian sidereal zodiac on a textual basis would be to point to the statements in Surya Siddhanta and the Puranas, which state that Aśvinī begins with the beginning of Aries. Now let's deal with that. In order to understand texts, hermeneutics, or principles about textual analysis have to be observed. And it is for this very purpose that 4 of the 6 Vedangas are created. Now, the Brahma Sutra summarizes the hermeneutics very succinctly in its 4th sutra, right after saying in Sutra 3, Shastram Yonitvat, the sacred text is the womb of knowledge. Then in text 4, he says how you will get this knowledge from the texts. And he says, Tattu Samanvayat, which means that those sacred texts have to be understood with Samanvaya, which means holism. The whole of it has to be correct, not just a part of it. Just relying on a part of it and interpreting a part of it will not give you a real comprehension of what the texts are attempting to give you. And any explanation of a text in which some of the statements are true, but that makes other statements false, that's not a good explanation. We call this Ardra Kukutinyaya, the logic of half a hen. You like the fact that the hen gives you eggs, but you don't like the fact that you have to feed the hen. So you cut the hen in half and just try to keep the part that gives you eggs. You're not going to get any more eggs. Ardra Kukutinyaya. So if you're just going to say, well, Aries and Aśvinī are said to be together, so that means that Aries has to always be aligned with Aśvinī. That's one statement, but that would contradict these other statements in the same texts that say that Aries begins with the equinox. That's not a good way of understanding texts. The correct way of understanding text is with samanvaya, to understand the text in a way that every statement in the text makes sense and rings true. So if we take this Aries-Aśvinī correlation as something definitive and permanent, then it makes the other statements wrong. It makes the statement that Aries begins with the equinox, which is fluid in relation to the nakshatras, it makes that have to be wrong. But if instead we realize that the correlation between Aśvinī and Aries is not a definition of the zodiac signs, but it's a definition of the relationship between the zodiac signs and the nakshatras. If we understand that, then we understand the text in a way that allows all the statements in it to be true. So then we have a good understanding of the text. We have an acceptable understanding of the text. So the Aries-Aśvinī statements are correlations of nakshatras to rashis. Correlation of nakshatras to rashis is essential for so many practical purposes, as I explained in the previous part where I talked about where the Babylonians changed their 18 ecliptical constellations to 12, so that they could correlate the equinoxes to the stars because it's more easily observable and they could fact-check their math by what's called Vedic Siddhanta in India. So every culture did this. Every culture correlated the stars to the equinoxes and solstices. The Egyptians did it, the Babylonians did it, the Greeks did it, and the Indians did it. Speaking of Greeks, Ptolemy himself, just like the Surya Siddhanta and the Puranas, states the position of the fixed stars in reference to the zodiac signs. Now he also, just like Surya Siddhanta and Puranas, clearly defines the zodiac as tropical. And he's also, since he's after Hipparchus, he also fully realizes that the stars and the solstices don't maintain a constant relationship. So if we say that the Aries-Aśvinī correlation mentioned in Surya Siddhanta and the Puranas amounts to a sidereal definition of the zodiac, we're making a statement that's as unreasonable as saying that Ptolemy was actually a siderealist. Because look, he said that Regulus was in Leo. To conclude now, we've covered a lot of text, and I hope that you haven't forgotten the direct texts that we've looked at, which directly show that the Vedic concept of the rashis is inherently tropical, meaning inherently bound and affixed to the solstices and equinoxes. So our textual analysis of the fundamental classical Indian texts has unequivocally showed a tropical definition of the zodiac signs. We also observed that these texts describe the correlation between the nakshatra and these signs, and that's perfectly reasonable. And these texts also imply that the correlation is not permanent because they speak about the stars lagging from the equinox. They speak about the effects of axial precession. So in conclusion, it's very, very clear, it's undeniably clear that the Vedas themselves, meaning the Yajurveda, its seed concept of the 12-fold divisions was tropical. The Siddhanta Surya Siddhanta has an explicitly tropical definition of the zodiac, and all the Puranas have an explicitly tropical definition of the zodiac. And we have to say that the Vedic concept of the zodiac follows the Puranic concept, which is tropical. I'm not saying that Indian astrology is not sidereal and hasn't always been sidereal primarily, but I'm saying that they made a break from their source texts. And as for why, please see the previous installment of this series. So thank you very much for watching, hopefully, all of these parts. We are now almost done. I'm going to do one more part where I'm just going to give you a final statement. And I hope you'll stick around for that.